I don't know what we're up to. Take 3.
That's
Take 21. Moon Knight Episode 1 was excitingly new because it had a very refreshing change of style from the typical Marvel content, especially in the way that a new hero is introduced, mostly because most of the time I had no idea what was going on. Episodes 2 and 3 continued with this different style, but began to drift towards a more typical action-focused Marvel story. And then Episode 4 came along, and we were left with that cliffhanger where once again no one had any idea what was happening, and I'd say that left everyone pretty excited for the 5th episode, which did not disappoint. Episode 5 has a very special place in my heart, and it makes me cry every single time I watch it. I'm not going to go into detail with what makes this episode so great because we'd be here a while. But to sum it up, there was lots of trauma and it was dealt with amazingly and it was very sad. So naturally, I loved it. And then episode 6, the finale. We all know that Marvel has a third act problem. And now with the TV shows, it's more like a final episode problem. Unfortunately, Moon Knight was... Well, it wasn't exactly ruined by this finale, but it was definitely taken down from one of the best superhero TV shows ever to just kind of average. It's bad enough that when I recommend the show to people, I genuinely tell them not to watch the last episode and pretend that episode 5 is the end, just because I think episode 6 does not do the rest of the show justice. So basically, today I'm going to talk about why I think that and why I hate the finale. But first, I'm going to talk about a reason that I didn't hate it, which is Jake Lockley. This is one of the criticisms that I see the most when talking about episode 6. Basically, everyone says that it was a cheap way to solve an impossible problem. But I personally thought that it was great because it cuts out and leaves the audience just as confused as Mark and Steven must be, just like how the first episode did this with Steven blacking out and then the third with Mark, which is a reason why I like the show so much because we never really knew what was going on. Sure, it's a cheap way to cut out the action and save them from a tough situation and probably cut down the costs to do all that CGI, but I think it adds to the suspense of who Jake is and how capable he is. To me, Jake was not the problem that ruined the finale. So for me, there were 3 main problems, and problem 1 is Steven coming back. Bringing Steven back after one of the most heart-wrenching moments of episode 5 feels extremely cheap and ruins the impact of that episode. The one thing that saves this was the 1 week wait for the people that watched it as it came out week by week. But imagine watching it without that. And the end of episode 5, you see Steven dying. And then literally in the next 5 minutes... So I just checked, and Steven coming back to life happens at 16 minutes and 40 seconds into the finale. However, the first 13 minutes and 10 seconds of that is all from Layla's point of view. So if we're counting only from Mark... That's a grand total of 3 minutes and 30 seconds from when Steven dies to when he comes back to life. 3 minutes! Are you kidding me? That is so cheap. The MCU in general just has such a big issue with not letting their characters die. Let's do a quick summary of all the fake MCU deaths that we've had so far.
Okay, there's a page called Resurrected Characters. My god.
That's probably not a good sign.
There are 90 pages.
Okay, so the most obvious is Bucky. We get an explanation for that literally 2 seconds after it's revealed that it's him as the Winter Soldier. It's not a great explanation, let's be honest, but it's still there. Also, I'm willing to let that pass because, come on, it's such a good plotline. And then we have Nick Fury in the same movie. There's Pepper Potts fake out in Iron Man 3, which again has an explanation of Extremis. There's Loki, which works because Loki is Loki. That's his entire personality. Then we have Groot in Guardians of the Galaxy. Though I don't know if that counts because baby Groot is sort of like the original Groot's child, but still. And then Wong dies and then he gets reversed back in time by Doctor Strange in that movie. And then there's also the entirety of Endgame as a movie, which main plot point is bringing people back to life. The problem with all this comes when the audience begins to sort of accept that the character will eventually, somehow, come back to life, which means that deaths in general won't have as much of an impact if there's ever a hint of doubt. My friend and I actually have a rule for this where we all say, no body, no crime, if there's ever a death in the MCU where the body isn't explicitly shown to be dead. And it has never been wrong except for that one time in Shang-Chi when the mum was actually dead. And now again here with Steven. The only explanation that we even get is Tawerit. No, I'm going to stop this up. Tawerit.
Yeah.
Tawerit? Okay. Tower. I don't know how to say. Tower. And the only explanation we get is when Towerit... hang on. I did it right. And the only explanation we get is Towerit saying...
Cyrus, you old softy! Now run!
Like, are you telling me that the only reason Stephen is alive is because the literal god of death felt bad because of Mark's little speech? Are you serious? How have more people not come back from the dead yet, if that's what happens? So that's the major issue, and then here we have a bit of a nitpick, but at the end of episode 5, it doesn't make much sense that the scales balance, since Jake hasn't even been mentioned yet, and the whole idea of the scales balancing was to show that Mark is, quotation marks, complete or whole, which doesn't work because Jake is still in there somewhere and Mark has no idea he exists yet. Now, I'm not suggesting that they should have kept Stephen dead completely, but it definitely should have had more lasting consequences and then a potentially bigger payoff later in the episode. And now for problem 2, big CGI fight. Here's another big issue that Marvel has. Third acts, more specifically making their third act one big, chaotic CGI mess. And with rare exceptions, this makes it feel less real with less stakes and makes the whole thing hard to care about. It's happened again and again in the MCU, and it's becoming even more clear in Phase 4, specifically with Shang-Chi and WandaVision, because now the visuals aren't even that good anymore. Here's some breaking news for the superhero genre. You do not need a big CGI fight boss battle to make a finale interesting, especially if you aren't even going to give the VFX artists enough time to make that fight look real. And now Marvel has done it again and ruined Moon Knight. Up until episode 6, it had been such a character-driven story, and it now devolves into big crocodile. There's a fight, there's another big moon god with... Then they fist fight, even though they're gods. But making it bigger makes it seem cooler, alright? It works. Boringness aside, it also doesn't make any logical sense. Amit needs to eat souls to get bigger, and then Khonshu just does... without needing to eat any souls or whatever. Like, where's the logic? They're gods, aren't they? Can't they do pretty much whatever? If you're going to go with magic, at least make some rules. Wouldn't it have been so much cooler if their fight had specific magic tied to what they were the god of? If Khonshu could manipulate the moon or have illusions, I don't know what's a common thing associated with the moon, but you get the point. They could have been creative. And then Amit could have had powers akin to Hela or just touch people when it causes death. The point is, they could have been a lot more creative with their fight than just a fist fight, but big, if they were going to go with that CGI route. At least then it would have been more fun to watch, and I might even have cared just a little bit. Instead, episode 6 seemed to go, alright, let's have our very, very powerful gods have a fist fight, but that's not that fun, so let's make them fight, but even bigger, which will hide our complete lack of creativity. Another problem with CGI fights is that the audience can't connect with the characters that are being CGI'd. You can't really feel the impact of a punch when the person being punched is a huge crocodile. For example, if Mark were to be punched and the audience sees the impact, you feel that, right? Because he's a human and you can connect with, you can empathize and be like, oh yeah, I see that would kind of suck. But that's impossible to do with big CGI monsters. You can't connect to it and therefore you aren't invested in the fight. Which then leads into the next problem. Problem 3, no stakes. As I said, the CGI makes the stakes go down for the battle because we can't connect to the godlike characters. This isn't helped by the fact that what they are fighting for doesn't have any stakes either. We already know that Amit won't win. The MCU isn't just going to go ahead and kill off all their characters in a side Disney Plus show. The entirety of the tension in that finale comes from whether Amit would succeed in eating everybody's souls or whatever she was trying to do, and we already know that won't happen, which means there's no tension. Number one way that this is usually fixed, given you have a proficient writer, is with character tension. So with character tension, you can make the stakes come from something that isn't the end of the world, something related to the character that has been built up this entire time and that the audience has begun to really care about. For example, Daredevil, throughout the entire series, but for now we'll just focus on the season 3 finale, the tension doesn't come from whether or not Matt will live through this fight with Fisk, but whether he'll kill Fisk and change who he is, breaking the code that he has followed so far of never killing people. Another example is Interstellar, best movie, which, while it does have an end-of-the-world stakes, it also has character tension because of Cooper's relationship with his daughter. But in this case, both work to add tension because it is a movie that doesn't have a reoccurring reputation for saving the world, as in the MCU won't just end the world in a sideshow. But when it's a standalone movie, especially directed by Christopher Nolan, maybe it will. Back to Moon Knight, giving character stakes to Khonshu or Amit is kind of impossible this late in the series, so that ship has sailed. But we can at least fix part of the problem using Mark or Steven. And I guess they kind of tried to do that. Mark at the end is given the option to kill Harrow, but Layla convinces him not to do it. I guess good try, buddy? Question mark. But personally, at least, I didn't feel that invested in Mark's decision here either, because he hasn't really been struggling with that for the past episodes. If they'd built this up as a character flaw more thoroughly in previous episodes as a conflict that Mark is facing within himself, it would have had a much bigger payoff when he eventually decides not to kill Harrow. But instead, this flaw so far has been a clash between Mark and Steven rather than just Mark. If you're going to go that route, it could have stayed as a Mark vs. Steven conflict, and you have the two of them arguing about it before then Steven finally gets through. My solution. I think it would have been such an easy improvement to ramp up the mystery about Jake. If you make a bigger deal out of it, suddenly there's a bunch more tension. Wouldn't it have been so much better if Mark and Steven have a huge freak out because they realize that they have another alter? They just sort of shrug it off in the finale, but I don't know about you, I'd be incredibly concerned if I knew that I could black out and just wake up surrounded by dead bodies. The writers could have brought back the mystery and tension from the first few episodes where Steven didn't know who Mark was, and had Jake be a much more pressing issue because they're in the middle of battle and they don't know what's going on and they need to stay alive, so randomly blacking out isn't really great. You could have Mark and Steven question what's happening more and actually need to figure out who Jake is, because I think it's pretty important to know who else you could be sharing a body with. They could have also, if they wanted to fix two problems in one, have kept Steven dead longer. You could have had Mark return from the dead seemingly alone, and then when he starts blacking out, suddenly there's the possibility that it's Steven, and all of a sudden, there's a bunch more tension. Everybody loves Steven, and we all want him back. By prolonging the impact of his death and then having Mark blacking out, suddenly the audience wants to know if it's him or if it's Jake and if Steven can come back. And then you could, around the climax, actually bring Steven back or reveal that to the audience. You could even, if this checks out for people with DID, make some statement about how alters are always there and are a part of them. The main positive about these potential solutions is that it creates tension from something that the audience can't predict and has impacts on characters that we've spent this entire season learning to root for and connect with, which works particularly well after episode 5, which destroyed me emotionally. I was devastated that Steven died, and I reckon that if they'd done what I'd suggested, I would have been rooting for Steven to come back the entire episode, and then therefore been much more invested. So that is how Moon Knight went from a wonderful, epic, character-driven story into a terrible CGI, chaotic finale. I do think that this speaks to a larger issue within the MCU about these third acts and CGI. As mentioned before, Shang-Chi and WandaVision both suffer from the same problems. Marvel, seriously, have you ever learned of this thing called learning from your mistakes? It's been an issue since phase 1. Let's think. Literally every movie, at this point, it's better to go by which movies don't have a third act problem with CGI. And the list of that is Captain America the First Avenger, Iron Man 3, Captain America the Winter Soldier, Guardians of the Galaxy, which the wonderful dance off to save the universe, Captain America Civil War, seriously, the Captain America movies solo, and then Captain Marvel. And then recently in the newer stuff, the only exceptions are none of them.
Yeah. Thor Ragnarok, yep. Black Panther, definitely. Holy shit, that was a disaster.
That was possibly the most egregious offender.
Avengers Infinity War, yep. Ant-Man and the Wasp, yep. Captain Marvel, no, surprisingly. Endgame, yes. Far From Home, yes. Black Widow, yes, unfortunately. Yeah, it has gotten worse in recent years. This is like proof. Shang-Chi, yes, unfortunately. Eternals, yes. Yes. Definitely. Strange Multiverse of the Madness, 100%.
The last movie without a big CGI fight at the end was in 2019 with Captain Marvel. And if you don't count that, since it's kind of debatable, then Civil War in 2016. As a reminder, that was 7 years ago. 7 years. Marvel, please stop. Get some help. From now on, if I ever mention Moon Knight, please know that I see it as a 5-episode series. The finale just doesn't exist. So that being said, Moon Knight is clearly the best Disney Plus show, and I love it so much. It's the best one.
You know, that was a very interesting point, actually.